Today we're going to be going over rescue awareness and operations, and we'll start. So it comes a number of different aspects, but a lot of TRT and other things like that. There's a ton of stuff that comes with rescue, requires very specialty training and expertise, and many times the medical side isn't as in depth, and other times it'll only be enough to get the patient off whatever area they're at, and then ground units will take over full from there. Sometimes there's going to be some treatment that will be up on as they're doing a TRT type rescue, and we'll look at a couple other different rescue types that they can do. The primary role of the paramedic and rescue operations have proper training, appropriate personal protective equipment, and basically allowing the medic to access the patient and treatment at the site throughout the incident. We'll talk about both what a medic will do as a rescue medic as well as what will non-rescue medic can do to assist in all these matters. Biggest thing with here is kind of knowing what to do, how to do it safely, and then using different techniques. We're not going to get too much into the rescue side as far as actual TRT-esque stuff because that's not what this class is. But we'll go over some of it and how medics fit into the rescue role. Biggest thing here, safety. Safety is always big, but particularly in rescue incidents, you don't want to become part of the hazard. As first responders in general, our job is to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, and we all want to go home at night. Pretty standard type thing here, but personal safety, safety of crews, safety of bystanders, and then finally the rescue of trapped and injured. A rescue, particularly some of the big TRT stuff, they're dangerous enough as it is, and we don't need to be adding to the incident and being unsafe about it. So just kind of going through all this. Big things in rescue operations and how basically a typical TRT-esque one will go down is arrival, scene size up, start working on hazard controls, and there's a number of different hazards that we'll talk about throughout here, from high angle, low angle rescues. We'll talk about a few of the other different ones that we can see out there. Trench rescue, swift water rescue. When it comes to water, water's super dangerous, and we'll see kind of all the things that TRT does. So there's a number of hazards that we can try and control or at least mitigate, and then we'll move on from there. Next, after the hazards that we can mitigate itself, as well as getting there, we'll work on gaining access to the patient, whether that's in getting up on the wall or on a building, towers, looking at other ways we can try and access the patient if in water, things like that. Next thing to do is gain access to the patient, then provide whatever immediate medical treatments needed. Many times this is not in-depth treatment. It can be as little as just trying to stabilize the patient. They might be in a panicked state, say on the side of a building hanging off something, and when the rescue medics will need to get up there, possibly sedate the patients a little bit so they can then actually disentangle them, which kind of comes next. Then they'll package the patient and move them off of the incident and down to where transport's available. Arrival and scene size up. The first phase of the rescue is scene size up. What is needed at an event? Even in general, if you are not part of a TRT team, but you see someone hanging from a rafter, hey, maybe we should get TRT out here. If you see them in the water, let's make sure we get water rescue. And it's all going to be TRT, but we're going to need water rescue type stuff out there. If it's a big entangled multi-vehicle wreck, we might need the heavy rescue. Still kind of same thing. We talk about extrication, and there's another different ones we'll kind of all go over, confined space, things like that. Just trying to get a quick 360 walk around, and then move on from there. So when we get into some of this, with the scene size up and ongoing evaluation of emergency scene, trying to figure out what's going on, what we can do to mitigate, what we can do to get rid of all the dangers. TRT rescues in general tend to be a little bit high risk anyways, and so making sure that we're doing everything we can to mitigate all these risks, get all the people there that we can that need to be there, getting TRT activated, the heavy rescue activated. When we talk about it'll be the same when we talk about hazmat in the next couple of weeks. Get the people there that need to be there that can help mitigate it sooner rather than later. Some of those units might be on another call, and the sooner that they can get released from there and activated, the better. There is some special equipment, and many times trying to get some of the stuff all set up to is time consuming as it is. So, trying to get enough people, get everyone on alerted and en route as soon as possible. Once they're there, seeing size up, same thing. They'll just start seeing what the TRT team will get there. The captain or BC or whoever else is running that at the time will start coming up with a plan on how to get the patient out of the incident that they are currently in and start trying to figure out the overall scene. This can, or the, and what everything's going on, this can sometimes take quite some time. Resources, depending on what resources are needed. TRTs are relatively all hazards s well, for example, LVFR is a all hazards department. They deal with hazmat, TRT, all the different things. The hazmat side, not a lot. Just because they're TRT doesn't mean they can respond to hazmat and vice versa. Also, but the TRT itself, as far as individual rescues, pretty much for most TRT teams throughout the U.S., if it's a hazard that their department can handle, usually the TRT can handle all of those individual different types of technical rescue events. However, sometimes they're going to need, if it's a big enough event, they might be calling on mutual aid for nearby ones. Hazard control, just identifying it, particularly in water, trying to make sure that we don't become drowned as well. We'll get in a little bit in the water rescues itself, maybe trying to trench rescue is a big one where they have to not splint up, but fortify the trenches to be able to extricate the patient out, or they're going to try and stabilize any type of fallen material. Same as like building collapse, things like that. TRT on, or so when they're talking about doing a maybe the side of a building, they just need to get all the ropes and make sure there's no other entanglements. Dustin, with who is in charge of training for TRT at LVFR, had a good one where they were talking about, I think it was Trump Tower. There's window cleaners up there. One came up and they're hanging down. So now you have those things on the platforms that are on the side of the buildings that could be swinging around too, and so they need to try and mitigate those. There's some there might be only minor mitigation. Other times there might be a ton of mitigation trying to go on before they can even attempt the rescue. There's a lot of different things that'll go on. Hopefully we'll get some time over down at LVFR and we'll be able to check some of these out and have the experts on the TRT team really go over a lot of the different things that they end up dealing with. So gaining access to the patient, this is where, and this can be kind of any number of factors, but when we're talking about, for example, the patient that was hanging off the side of the building, they're going to have to usually rappel down to them if they can, and most of the time they can gain access to the roof. If it's not too high, they can use a truck with a ladder on top. Those ladders typically are 100 to 105 feet, at least at LVFR and most of Las Vegas. And most trucks throughout the nation tend to not get higher. That they're, I don't know the exact average, but it's usually somewhere between 90 and 120, maybe the tops. But usually around a 100-foot ladder. It's about 10 stories. We have a lot of buildings that are a lot taller than this, so they have to try and gain access otherwise. Another one that we can kind of see that they do a yearly training on is a rescue off the giant wheel, Ferris wheel thing by Flamingo. So there's a ton of things that we can kind of look at and ways that they're going to try and gain access to this patient for water. Sometimes they'll use that same truck and extend the ladder out over the flowing water. And I know many times in Vegas we don't really think of water being a huge issue, but if you've lived here long enough, you've seen everything flood and how people have to deal with that. So it's a flash flood, which tends to be quite a bit more dangerous than the standard river because it's moving quick, fast, and hurry, and people aren't prepared for it. And so dealing with that. Depends on all the different types. We'll look at some of the different ways that they will gain access to the patient throughout here. Again, this is not a super fancy TRT course by any stretch of the imagination. This is a familiarization and trying to figure out where the medic's role fits in, as well as for the people that are either interested in TRT or might already be on a TRT team, and how their role will change a little bit. Obviously, their Department of Peace will really specify that, but it'll also show how a medic on a TRT team can kind of act and react with all this. So it's kind of what some of this is. Specialty tools, there's all types of them, from ropes, rescues, ladders, boats, throw devices for water rescues. There's any number of events, and some of this will be like wilderness type rescue that we'll talk about. And some of those, the real specialty might be some of the volunteer departments or the volunteer search and rescue kind of departments, but organizations like Red Rock Search and Rescue. So there's quite a number of one. And the National Park Service does pretty well. They have a couple at the canyon that do some really interesting one. They work with, they have both volunteer and then the paid, and they'll do a lot with different types of helicopters too. And this isn't, most of the people on these helicopters usually might be medics, but they're not sometimes even medics. They might just be EMTs or even less, but they're very good at the rescue portion, ropes, pulling people out, things like all that. So a few different things I will kind of look at here. So some examples of rescue. Sometimes we forget, or sometimes it's quite obvious, but like when we talk about the heavy rescue, when we call the heavy rescue, what they're looking for. And heavy rescue really specializes in a number of things, but many times what some of the stuff that they do can even just be very difficult vehicle extrications, large vehicles, semi trucks, buses, things that a normal engine might not be able to take care of. And so hydraulic tools are number one. So all the way on the left is we have what they call cutters. The spreaders are next in the middle, and on the two middle ones are different types of spreaders, and then far right, or as we look at the picture, is going to be a hydraulic jack or a ram. Basically, it keeps extending out just a pole, and but all these are under hydraulic pressure. Or all these, for example, are under hydraulic pressure. We have a couple different examples of a single lumen hose, which has much like a single lumen dual lumen catheter for an IV. One has a high pressure going to the tool on the inner part of the hose, and then an outer pressure circulating the fluid back to the power head, which is the machine right here. On the next, as you see the dual lumen, where you have, or sorry, the single lumen but dual hosed ones. This is a little bit older. We don't see those as much. And then nowadays, particularly with LVFR, they run mostly electric battery powered ones, and we'll talk to some of the guys in class, and we'll see them out in the field trip when we get that chance. And these are all just some different devices that we can see for extrication and hydraulic rescue tools. There'll be a number of other ones that we will go over under individual, when we talk about individual rescues and types of jobs that they'll look at trying to do, especially like water rescue, confined space, some things like that. Some departments, like in Arizona, where they will have a very good TRT and rescue team, but those guys will also be hazmat qualified, and then they have all that. And sometimes bigger departments will either specialize in either TRT or hazmat. So there's just a number of special tools that will go through all of this. Some things that they might try and do they might try and, if the medic is up there, they might try and get some fluid. They might try, particularly if it's a diabetic accident or something like that, maybe give a little bit of D50. If they have an idea of what's going on prior to the rescue attempt, they can try and bring that specific thing, but they are definitely not bringing up a full entire med bag by any stretch of the imagination. They're usually grabbing what they think they need. Sometimes it might just be narcs, such as some type of sedative, things like that, to kind of work to help the patient initially, possibly a BBM or something if they think that patient's there. But many times, very little is being done. Supraglottic would probably be very effective in this sense because you're not going to be able to tube necessarily upside there. That being said, one of the coolest tubes I ever heard when I was in medic class, one of the guys that was working at the fire department of Sedona, one of his crew members they have a lot of cliff rescues out there because people are out there doing silly things. And one of the guys was rappelling down, ended up kind of in a upside down because the car was hanging off a cliff somewhat, half partially down there, just because there's some pretty steep cliffs and roadways through there, and ended up using a digital intubation with the fingers upside down and tubing a patient. And it's one of the coolest tubes I ever see. If I ever do that, I'm going to retire shortly after that because I can never top that. So there's some cool ways that you can kind of work around different situations. And the thing about TRGs, you never know necessarily what you're going to get. They try and have some decent trainings, but it's not necessarily a set protocol. They have to kind of work around what they find at the time. So it's a really interesting job. So disentanglement. Here's with all the different parts of TRT. Here's a big or an example of just a pretty basic car disentanglement and the example of this whole process. First, the medics would show up. They'd see this car in there. They go, "Hey, we're going to need some type of extrication equipment and rescue. Doors won't open. We're going to go ahead and try and see what the patient is. Say they're alive. All right, we know at this point they're just going to need to get the patient extricated. They're going to work on a solution as far as cutting the car apart. This was one of my favorite parts of the job because every firefighter knows how to cut open a car. There is people who are specialized in very difficult ones, but I actually got to teach this a couple times. I really enjoyed cutting open a car. Hard work though, a lot of heavy tools and things moving sharp. If you don't have protective equipment, and out here the privates are not issued any type of like protective turnouts. Out in Arizona, we did have turnouts for accident scene. They were at once fire rated mostly, but they weren't meant to do any type of fire stuff. We had no SCBAs or anything like that, but it was would allow us. We did some of our own extrication, but a lot of times it would be for us to, if we could get access to the patient inside the car, they could start cutting open the car around us while we were treating a patient inside of the car. And that's not too uncommon throughout the United States of having the medics inside. I would be very cautious doing that out here, and unless you guys talk with the fire crew and they're very task saturated, maybe they can see if you want in there. Many times out here, I would just sit in the back of or sit to the back of closer to the back of the scene, allow them to do their thing, and then once the patient was extricated, I'd be ready with my gurney. I'd have IV stuff set up inside the vehicle. All this, it all kind of depends on where you're at, what you're doing. But the biggest thing with disentanglement is getting whether it's the environment tangling the patient or the environment entrapping them, like a trapped vehicle, cut wires, anything like that. That's where they're going. Like this disentanglement process begins or is part of. And there's just so many ways here. We can't talk about every single one here. Just kind of getting in some generalities, and we'll try and hit some of the other ones. Hopefully, we'll get a little bit more from LBFR, or we'll talk about some of it in class if you have any specific questions. Patient packaging. This is an example of something that they can place a patient on. It's a special board, a little bit flexible, but still plastic. Those usually can float as well, depend on whether you're trying to do water rescue, ice rescue, cold water. They will also use these for just cliff rescue. They'll put the patient up on secure them on there and then get them down. Many times though, if they're able to actually still move about, they can help them down depending on kind of what the situation, what it all is. Other times they will just connect them to a harness, put a new harness on, and then drop them down. There's a ton of ways, and so we'll try and get over some of this more in class. And some of this, we could talk about all these, and you might not see any of these throughout your career, but you'll see 4 other different ways that you wouldn't see in your career over the next week. You never know how some of these go. TRT's very interesting that way. Some other patient packaging is just an example. The one time I find a backboard still useful in this day and age is usually with transporting a patient some type of distance. I still think a scoop stretcher is a little bit better and more effective. That being said, backboard usually works pretty solidly. So we have some other different types of stretchers here. We had one of these on our BC rig out in Arizona. They had the Stokes basket with that giant wheel, which It's kind of a pain in the butt, and it does, but it that wheel works a ton better than trying to move your gurney out there. If any of you guys have even tried to move your gurney across a parking lot with a couple too many bumps, like it gets caught on quite heavily. You start getting dirt, sand. Otherwise, if you've never tried to move a gurney in sand, good luck. It sucks uh, if it works at all. So as you can see, these little things kind of fold down. There's all types of different devices that can help with this, and usually some of them are pretty cool. Some of them are a little bit pain in the butt to use, but they're still pretty useful. Worst comes to worst, Mega Mover works just as easy. So some different devices. There's a number of different ones that we can look at. Here's an example of being used at. This is almost what we'll see at LVFR many times. Okay, off their training tower there. They'll go up there. They have one of their TRT guys as a patient. They'll get them on there, and they'll go down. As you can see, with all these different ropes, they have a ton of different backup safety things, because as well, different safety ropes to make sure everyone's getting off it or is being safe. And if there's a failure, they will. So this takes a little bit to set up. TRT is not a typically fast process. It is slow and steady kind of wins the race here. They have a ton of different equipment that they'll use too. The other thing on this slide, as you guys can see, is that they use some type of kind of climbing helmets. There's a number of different ones I've seen. These are relatively standard. They have their safety harnesses. Many of the are, if you're doing any type of this, you can make or tie your own, which we did in the military many times. They're wildly uncomfortable, but they're just as they're decently effective too. They're just it uses a rope instead, but not to say you should go make your own, but there's different ways that they can try and use some of these harnesses. But they have really nice harnesses, carabiners, climbing ropes, different types of ropes that are meant for different things. They have a full on mini academy in their all the different TRT programs do, and I believe a couple months long, and you have to learn all the different rope knots, what all the different types of ropes are for, what's a life safety rope or an equipment rope. So we'll go over some of these. This is just an example there. Another example of different types of, these are all harnesses, different types of helmets, and things like that. Yeah, bloodborne pathogens. There's always got to be released, I guess. Surface water rescue is, once again, its own thing. Also, as I said, even in the middle of the desert, we do it here. They do water rescue here, both swift water, static water. One thing they're probably not as well trained on is ice type rescues. We actually had some out in Arizona at one of my departments, because we had to respond to a small lake out there that would freeze over during the wintertime, or partially freeze, so people would be on ice and it'd collapse, and we had to go out there. Uh, Not that that won't happen here, that the guys that Vegas isn't trained, LVFR isn't trained up on that, but we tend to not have a lot of frozen bodies of water to have that be a primary concern. It's just a different type. So we'll see different types of water rescue. These are some of the most dangerous. Even if you're a strong swimmer, you get into water moving very quickly. Can it can move entire fire engines. There's a picture somewhere of I've seen all the time where you have a city fire rescue years and years ago. This might have been late 90s, early 2000s, where the fire engine was in the middle of an intersection getting roped out by a helicopter. The personnel were, because a flash flood hit them. So you've got to be very careful with this. It can move semi trucks, fire engines, all types of things. If water's moving at fast enough water's moving at a fast enough rate, it moves it down, and it's a lot less than you think it is. It'll move 70-ton tanks in the military too. Water's not a joke. You should never be trying to, and we talk about any type of water rescue, and this is where some of this does apply to us almost directly. If you see someone drowning, it is one of the biggest things. Don't jump in the water and trying to do it yourself. The person drowning will try and pull you down. It's not malicious. They're on a completely flight or fight mentality. If you guys remember, kind of way back in the first semester when I was going over mental states and fight or flight type situations. This is definitely what we call like being in the black, where there's no thought process really besides that attempt to try and survive. And if you go out there, they will try and drown you. They'll try and pull you under because all they're seeing is something that they can grab onto and not drown. So you got to be very cautious. Might be a little bit different if it's a very small kid. I would still be cautious. If it's a baby, you're probably fine. Um, if they're already unconscious, you still don't want to jump in. You got to be careful there. And it's then not a single person event. It's an example of kind of this is almost or this is how rapids work in a river. This is how and these different eddies where people drown. This is actually a special type of dam, particular art that kind of flows here. They are very, very dangerous. As soon as you get into this current here, it has a high, almost if not 100% mortality rate if you get down into there. You got to be very cautious because it'll pull you under and it'll spin you around in those loops and it'll until you drown. And sometime later, it will probably spit your body out. And this area is you got to be very cautious. People who will go swim on there have ropes, not swim on there, but do rescues will have ropes attached to them. Even them getting in the water is very far down the list of what they want to do. It's a very dangerous and high risk job. They'll try and throw a rope, throw a ladder, throw something if someone is stuck in that there. So look at going there further. But there's also some other things, and many of the things that we see above the water, it may seem relatively calm. However, under the water, there's all types of things in there, particularly when we talk about uh, flash flooding. Because it's flooding in areas that are normally not full of water, it's not used to water flowing through there, and we don't know what is currently hidden underneath there. And there's all types of junk in the whether it's in a wash or one of the pre-made washes throughout the city that they made to try and prevent or help with all the flooding. And there's all types of just random things, whether it's moving or shopping carts that then get pushed up, get caught on something, and things that you'd never see or think in there, and you step in and get swept through. Strainers or other object, and that's an example of a random one, but that's a very Vegas example of being like a couple shopping carts from our population that currently does not have a home that got flushed. The flood came, hit them, and now it's getting caught under there. The water's flowing through it, but then if you get into that water, you will be not flowing through it. Foot or extremity entrapment. This can happen in any type of water type movements, and this is another one of those same type things where we got to be really careful because especially when water's pushing against you, you'd put your foot in and trap your foot as you go to pull, but because the water's pushing you so far, and no matter how strong you are, water's stronger. And your foot gets entrapped, it's pushing you away, and because the angle you went in to get your foot in there is now different due to the water pushing you at a different angle, you're not able to pull your foot away, and you just continue to push down and then drown. No fun. Don't do it. Real bad. And so the way that you'd have to rescue that person out is to get them at the same angle they went in, and then pull them out that way. Flat water. Examples of flat water: lakes, ponds, marshes, places that hold water. We have even places that hold water within Henderson that has, as well as other parts of Vegas many times. I just have flown over quite a few of them where they have those standing industrial water retention kind of areas, and it's just water that they're using for industrial purposes, but it's just flat, not moving at all. Many times but in particular, this mainly has to do many times with just lakes, which we have lake rescue. Both we have Lake Las Vegas and a couple of the small, nice, somewhat nice areas of town have like little lakes where houses are up against, kind of like Lake Las Vegas. But then you got the big lakes, have Mead, Mojave, and then the river in between. And the river's its own very challenging thing just because of how much water's moving there, the speed of it. If you want to see some interesting areas, if you go down to Parker, Arizona, just below Havasu, it's considered the river, but it has dams on either side. However, it seems nice and flat and not moving very quickly, if at all. However, the current is quite strong. It's nothing crazy on that part of the river because it is controlled on either side by a dam, so it's not really a lake, but it's also not really a river. Or it is a river, but it's just a very challenging or surprising area where they get a lot of rescues. And then you add a little bit of ETOH out on any of those. Colorado River has some party areas. Havasu is a big one like that, and so a number of issues can come with flat water rescues. Some people think they can. You don't have the crazy water pushing you in like the big lakes, but when you start adding other substances, or it seems really hot out, so you jump in and it's nice. However, 60-degree water will dump your body temperature really low, and now you're becoming hypothermic. You're not able to react how you initially would, or how you normally would, or be able to even swim as well, and you will start to succumb to your the temperatures, and you have a more difficult time staying alive, and that's what they're kind of talking about with the temperature and moving into hypothermia. Um, and many people don't plan on being in the water when they are end up in there around flat water, whether it's falling off a dock or the boat, not expecting in it. There's a number of ways that people end up in the water and all of a sudden they're not expecting or wanting to be there, and their swimming ability might reflect that kind of general idea, and so they're not going to do very well. And so that's why on all boats they have to have, if you have a boat or you've been on one, you have to have a life jacket for every person on there that's rated to a certain. There's different types. 1 and 2 is a pretty is a you have a lot more flexibility. It doesn't quite, but it has a couple things because it's more for working. These are very similar to the ones that you would use also if you're skiing, as opposed to using the old orange ones, a little head ref. Those orange ones work pretty well if they're strapped on correctly, for the reason that they are they keep the head up and supporting water, or supporting your head and neck so that you can breathe air and not water. So those ones work really well, particularly for people who don't swim and aren't necessarily working. And then there's a few other ones. Well, we're not going to get too much into PDFs because our personal flotation devices, just kind of talking about some of those. Very useful, but if you're doing any type of rescue work, almost always they have PDF, life jackets, PDFs, personal flotation device on. One other thing is sometimes they're not as, even like Coast Guard swimmers, they might not even have a very obvious one, but it's one that can inflate if needed. And so it might be one where they can do some quick dive or underwater real quick. So they don't need to, some of it they don't always want to be floating all the time. However, if needed, now they have that'll inflate and be used as a PFD at that time. I keep saying PDF. I'm sorry. Too much office work, guys. Uh, PFD, personal flotation device. So water temperature and how dangerous it is. Water temperature with less than 98 degrees can cause hypothermia. If you stay in any water temperature less than 98 degrees long enough, you will start to become kind of hypothermic, because it's going to radiate it. All the temperatures trying to equalize. So if your body temp at 98 and the water's 90 degrees, sounds nice, and it would take quite some hours to eventually get there. Uh, and you can become mildly hypothermic eventually. But as that temperature starts to decrease, as we can see here, all of a sudden it takes less time in order for your body to try and, or it will, as it's to match the water temperature. And as we kind of see here, water it causes heat loss 20 times faster than it does exposure to air at the same temperature. It conducts heat away from the body very, very well. So we got to be very conscious of that, of getting in. Another reason to be conscious when we're in the water and what we have to be aware of, if we're trying to help these people. So another reason not to just jump into the water, besides the people drowning you, is hypothermia. 70 degrees seems like not that bad, but it eventually can cause it. Typically 3 hours before you start becoming hypothermic. Now, 40 degrees, less than an hour. Right around, it looks 50-ish degrees. It takes about an hour for you to become hypothermic and start increasing your risk of death. And we can just see how that kind of moves up. Anytime that it causes a uh, cold enough to produce the reflex and gasp, termed cold shock, you can lose. So if it causes you to gasp when you jump in, you have chance to lose hand coordination within 60 seconds and loss ability to use your arms within 5 minutes. So as we can see there, it doesn't take that much to cause this lack, or to kind of cause other issues. If you can't move your arms, all of a sudden you can't swim very well, if at all. It's some issues. So cold protective response. Now on the other side, when we talk about environmental type care, like if you guys remember back to trauma, and when we talked about how some people can survive. Usually, the younger the better. Pediatrics tend to do very well with that. Older patients, as they get older, not as well. But there's stories of people even in their 20s being found several hours, up to 12 hours later, without a pulse. But once they started resuscitating, then they came back with minimal neurodeficits and still alive. So definitely a possibility. Something really cool. Got something to be cautious of. And one of those things, and one of the reasons that works, is that mammalian diving reflex. And that's what really increases their chance of surviving in that cold water, so long as, or, and how it works. It's kind of the following. If you guys don't remember, or if I didn't go over it enough in trauma, but it causes basically parasympathetic stimulation when cold water hits our face. It's why we can also use this as a vagal maneuver technique. And what happens is it kind of hits the face, hits our trigeminal nerve, the three different aspects, hence trigeminal, and then it sends a signal to the pons and medulla, and causes basically the body to slow down. Bronchoconstriction. The reason we want bronchoconstriction in that phase is so we're not getting water down our windpipe. Causes the heart to slow down a ton, and the rest of the body just to slow down some, and it's a protective mechanism. The only mammals that use this differently, and it's a kind of a specialty one, would be animals that actually live in the water many times, like whales and other animals, as well as like sea lions and things like that. Sea lions use a little bit. There's a few different things, but that's also how they're able to somewhat dive so deep. The whales tend to not, but the other animals do use it more so. And we'll kind of look at some of the, are not that important because we're not talking about animals, but it's that same concept that allows some of the mammals to survive underwater for so long. It's that same type of mammalian diving reflex. But some of the ones that are very waterborne use it a little bit different than the rest. Anyways, moving on, cold respective response and can improve brain viability in patients who suffer prolonged submersion. There's stories all over of particularly pediatrics that were underwater for hours, get resuscitated, and have zero deficits. One of the stories for that, about the 20-year-old, his was, I think he's in his 18 or 20 somewhere. He had some deficits, but he was in a snowbank for 12 plus hours. But talking all this, he just had some inability to, not ability to walk very well. He had an unsteady gait. He had some coordination issues, but he survived, which is insane for being in the cold without basically a pulse for what they assume is around 12 hours or longer. It's pretty impressive. So at a certain point, it no longer becomes a rescue and it becomes a body recovery. When you move to recovery and part of the incident, things move a little bit slower. They start doing things. Anytime you have scuba diving involved, it's typically not a rescue anymore. There's obviously exceptions to that, but we still see this out here. Or in Vegas, we'll just wait for the water to drain out of Lake Mead way lower and start looking for barrels. Yeah, sorry, back to so rescue versus the ability to save a life and recovery later. If they will, one apartment I was at had a sign up a lot on the wall, and it was risk a lot to save a lot, risk a little to save a little, and risk nothing to save nothing. If we're talking about that it's moved to recovery operations and it's any type of extra dangers, many times they will wait till the storms end, the floods kind of recede, because at that point there's no point in having excess risk to the rescuers or even the body recovery specialists during any type of incident. They'll wait for everything to calm down and minimize risk that way. In water spinal immobilization, for any of you guys who've done any type of lifeguard work, this is definitely a thing. Also, due to many people who have kind of reverting back to trauma a bit, many people who have issues in the water, particularly like pools or shallower waters, especially if there's any type of jumping or diving in, have a tendency to have done that and induce that injury due to diving in and hitting their head and have a relatively high chance, at least there's a decent possibility of having C-spine injuries, and that's why they drowned. They either got knocked unconscious or they could possibly be paralyzed. Some different ways that they'll do water rescue with that, try and use the patient's own arms to secure themselves to the gurney or to the stretcher. There's a number of different ways. If once again, we shouldn't be getting in the water. If you're lifeguard, like it's not extremely difficult these, but we're not going to go over training and how to do this. This is more familiarization side right here. Um, this is really big into most type of rescues, including all the fancy TRT teams. They still abide by these types of rules. We did this in the military too. Unfortunately, you guys just saw some of the, if you guys were paying attention to some of the news, where some Navy SEALs were jumping off or were taking over a ship. They're slightly different, but they were climbing up, going into the ship. One of the guys fell off as they were climbing off, and his buddy jumped in after him. Don't know exactly at the time of me recording this. Never found the bodies. Who knows if they ever will? That being said, uh, water can be extremely dangerous, and this is an example of that. Navy SEALs are very good at swimming. It's literally half their job, and you get into crappy weather, even just water movement, and all of a sudden it's very hard to keep your head above the water. Um, that was a little bit side note, not directly applicable, but semi applicable. That being said, one of the big things, reach, get something that they can reach out there. It's long board, some type of pole. Those little, if you ever saw these in the on the side of your pool, if you have a pool at your apartment complex, many times it has just a loop at the end. And you reach out, you can get a 2x4 or anything and try and just pull them in. Next, you try and throw. So throw type a, you see these once again at those same pools and maybe in your neighborhood. They will throw a rope with a float or buoy at the end, grab that and then pull the patient in. Next, they will try and they'll take some type of boat, row out there, and still they're reaching out with the paddle to try and get them to hold on to and calm them down. Lastly is going. I believe I have a video in here on the Dane, unless it was in the trauma version, where I go over how they teach the swim qual one, the Marines, in boot camp you basically have 4 swim calls, and you have to, no matter what, get swim call 4, and that's just basically some basic swimming and surviving with your gear on in water, and then all the way to swim call 1, where you're qualified to go do water rescues. It is really difficult there. There's harder swimming quals out there, but it's a Coast Guard rescue swimmers, people like that, SEALs. But I have a video, I believe, on here, and if not, you can find it in class. We didn't watch it in trauma, and it's watching drill instructors as they pull you down, and you basically, if the patient isn't unconscious yet, many times they will grab on you and try and pull you underwater with them. If you don't try to, and basically what they taught us in the Marines was, you pull them underwater with you and you drown them, and then you pull them back up, swim them to shore, and revive them. It's the best way to do it if they're being any type of combative. Self-rescue techniques, things you can do if you find yourself in water. They work decently, and there's all types of ones that can work. You can make your pants a somewhat of a life vest. Even when they're filled with water, you can take them off, tie it off at the end, and there's a technique where you move your pants up and down, kind of slapping the water with them. And what it does is it fills up with air pretty well, and you can tie it around and use it as a flotation device. One of the random things that got this in the race. So, kind of cool. Some things to kind of look at and think about. But basically, if you end up in the water, any type of thing, whether on the job or not, some things that you can kind of look at doing: cover your mouth and nose during water entry so you don't swallow any water. Protect your head and keep your face out of water. Sometimes you can tuck your head in, depending on how you're doing this, and so you don't want your head to be hit. And then when you get that opportunity, go up. If you found yourself underwater and you're having a hard time finding up due to whatever, let out a little bit of air out of your lungs. Watch where the bubbles go, and that's where you need to start heading towards. In flat water, some of the help position is what you see here. Moving water, do not attempt to stand up. That's where you can get your foot caught in there and done. What you should do, you can lay on your back, try and keep your feet and your whole body horizontal to the top of the water and the ground, and float as well as you can. Typically, kind of want your feet heading downstream if possible, so then you're not going to hit your head on any objects, and your head pointed towards the nearest shore at a 45-degree angle. So there is some things. This is not a water safety course, guys. These are just some things you can kind of look at if you find yourself in a situation. Here's a video. I don't believe these show up on the recorded version, but it's pretty interesting. If you can see from this snapshot, you have to learn to drag. That is a marine, not a mannequin, even though his skin's very, very white, and they're getting dragged through the water. So, quite a bit of a challenge, and this actually might be swim call too, but it's pretty challenging. And when you go to recon or some of the other ones, one of the ones I was doing, trying out for recon things, it was having to put a rifle above your head and tread water for 30 minutes. A lot of this is very difficult. Swimming is a very, very challenging idea. So we're going to look at first some hazardous atmospheres. This is a little bit of a cross between TRT and hazmat. The job's still TRT, but it has a hazmat aspect to it, and it's not necessarily a hazmat, like there's not necessarily hazardous material in there so much as a lack of oxygen many times in it, so it's an oxygen deficient atmosphere. There can be other things in there where it's not just atmospheric deficient environments, can have some type of toxic or gas, even such as nitrogen, and we'll look at that. So they're typically, and so what are confined spaces? In general, it has limited access or egress and not designed for human occupancy or habitation. This can be man-made or things like caves. If you guys remember a few years back, there's a whole, I believe it's in Thailand, a whole class got stuck in some underwater caves, and they had to try and rescue them by pulling them all out. The cave was above water, but the entry and exit was filled with water due to some flooding that weren't expecting. So they had to get in there. And so you have these one-way or small entrances and exits. In the Midwest, they see a lot of grain silos or other types of things. And in industrial areas, people go in there to weld up the inside of a tank, something like that. And we'll have some examples. And they get in there. Many times what happens is the first guy, all of a sudden he'll see his buddy unconscious, and one of his coworkers will go in there to help him, and then they go unconscious too, due to the lack of oxygen. The lack of oxygen is also very interesting because that's a new way that they just started doing executions, particularly in Alabama. It's the only one who's done it so far, and they basically just take up give the patient nothing but oxygen, the prisoner nothing but oxygen, and what it does in this nitrogen toxicity. And we're not talking about the diving aspect where it's going to expand or contract, but what it does is it just displaces all the oxygen in there. Nitrogen's very inert towards our body. It doesn't really do anything bad, but what it does is it takes up the place of oxygen, and that's why we do nitrogen washout prior to trying to intubate a patient. But then it just takes all the place of oxygen. It's just sitting in there, nitrogen chemicals and molecules, and just sits in there and allows oxygen not to take the place. And then we go unconscious rather rapidly. Sometimes only a couple minutes, sometimes quicker, and then we die. So There it is. Here's an example of going in there doing tank. They might be in there doing welding. They're supposed to have airflow in and, or sorry, O2 in, yes, and a pump pulling air out. So there's this constant flow of O2, but sometimes there's a failure in there. Sometimes, and it's usually not like pure oxygen always, depending on whatever situation, if there's any flow, they might just have normal room air. Like scuba divers, they tend not to be on usually on any type of extra oxygen. It's just compressed air, much like SCBA, and just self-contained breathing apparatus for sorry guys if you haven't, or anyone who's not familiar with that. And all it is most of the time it's just regular air. You typically, if you're welding, you don't want a pure oxygen float into your area. It makes everything rather flammable. So there's basically, according to OSHA, 6 major hazards associated with confined spaces. There can be an oxygen deficient atmosphere, a chemical or toxic exposure or explosion, engulfment, such as like a trench type rescue, where they're in there, they didn't shore up the walls very well, and then the dirt falls down on them, and so they can be engulfed. Or another one they'll see in the Midwest is those big silos full of grain. Someone will fall in there and they can't get out of it because it acts like quicksand itself, and some other things like that. Machinery entrapment, whether it's their body partially entrapped in there. It could be a big old tool, it could be a malfunction that causes it. There's a number of different ones that can cause this. Electricity and structural concerns such as a building collapse. Electricity is kind of or you might not be able to move due to an electrical current. The cable just fell and on some type of metal surface, say in an industrial complex, and now you can't leave where you're at because there's the metal is conducting electricity from that wire. I'm not familiar with that one as well, in the sense of confined spaces. Well, if in class we have one of our TRT guys here, we can talk about it. So oxygen deficient atmosphere is kind of what we're talking about, and it's not always just oxygen. Now it's just a example that we'll see, but what happens is it can be displaced by either neutral or toxic gases that are colorless, often odorless, and therefore undetectable. So what you'll see all of a sudden their buddy go down, jump in, and then they go down. So the issue with oxygen rich, extremely fire hazard. If you ever had anyone who has been smoking with their O2 on, the O2 oxygen itself is not flammable, but it is part of the fire tetrahedron. So it needs fire, fuel, heat, and O2. O2 is what it needs for fuel to burn. But if you start adding oxygen to anything, it makes it very, very easy to catch fire or spread fire, because now all of a sudden you don't need nearly as much. Many times fire is limited in its growth potential due to the lack of oxygen. If you start adding oxygen, all of a sudden that fire will continue to just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Hence why when you're trying to start a fire, you start blowing on it. The idea is you're not trying to blow it out. You're trying to get more oxygen in there, and when that happens, all of a sudden it lights up. Bellows in a forge, blacksmithing things. When you see that big old billow, they start pumping it. All of a sudden, that air, it's just pushing air into the fire, and it causes the fire to flame up. The fuel and the fire is already there. The heat's already there, and there is oxygen there. But when you increase the amount of oxygen, it increases the amount of fire. So there's that basic concept. So 21%, that's normal breathing. I don't know why it says impaired at that point, but 19, you start getting minimum for safe entry. At 16, you start getting impaired judgment. I think that's got somehow transposed right here. The 21 and 16. 21's room air, as we should know. I believe that just got transposed. Sorry, I don't know. But next, all of a sudden, we start getting faulty judgment and rapid fatigue, and then difficulty breathing, followed by death. And this tends to happen. This is also very similar to the flight environment. If you ever have to take a high RA your FPC test, they talk about these type of things, but it's because of oxygen deficient atmospheres, such as decompressing the pressure in your aircraft and causing you to lose seconds and lose consciousness, sometimes in a matter of seconds at like 40,000 feet. So there's a number of things that you can kind of look at. Anyways, moving on. Chemical and toxic exposure explosions. Oxygen can be removed by certain chemical reactions. They may pose high risk for explosions, so they may scrub the oxygen out, and it may be just they need it to not have oxygen in there in order to reduce the chances of explosions. However, then that goes in. And so most of the time, most common hazard types in confined spaces. Here's a quick pie graph. Hydrogen sulfide, 77% of the time. Carbon monoxide, 61. That is not a good pie graph because that does not make sense. I don't know where that numbers come from. Anyways, moving on. One thing I did want to talk about, and it's the, all right, doesn't want to scroll back. The oxygen, particularly in silos, and we saw this a couple years back in Turkey. They had these giant grain silos on the docks, and it basically, a spark happened, entered this area, and it caused a massive explosion that was on par with a small nuclear weapon. If you guys, for the elderly people like myself, you guys remember back at the beginning of the Iraqi war, we had dropped a bomb called the Moab, mother of all bombs. And someone came up with Moab, father of all bombs, I don't know, but one up in one another. But initially, they were using some in Afghanistan, and this was more. They used it more for this, but they called it daisy cutters, and that technically originated back in Vietnam, and it's for a very specific purpose. The reason I'm talking about this, it's a very interesting concept. So it's called a fuel-air bomb. What happens is right before they'll drop this bomb, it all of a sudden disperses its fuel as far as it can, right, within seconds of it all exploding. And what it does is much like your car fuel injector or carburetors back in the day, it tries to get the most ideal mixture of the amount of fuel close to the amount of air, and it spreads out. And what happens then is the initial explosion goes off, and all that fuel that's out into the air around it, that's spread over a decent amount, then is able to ignite and be part of the explosion itself. And that's what happens in these silo explosions, is all of a sudden you'd have all this grain, which normally we don't think of grain as flammable, but it's carbon, burns, right? So it's spread out into these tanks, mixed with air, and all of a sudden a small spark then can catch that tiny little bit of fuel there. It's not normally super flammable, but because it has the right mixture of air and fuel, and it just causes this gigantic explosion. The reason they're called daisy cutters back in Vietnam is due to the jungle. The Air Force or the military basically would drop what they call these daisy cutter bombs. And what it would do, they drop it, it explodes, and it's such a large explosion that it would cut all the trees down, so then they could land helicopters and make an LZ, the landing zone. When they made that mother of all bombs back in the early 2000s and dropped it, it's like on part of Florida area, I believe, if I remember right. But they had to let Russia and other places know that they were not dropping a nuclear bomb. Instead, it was there because it's very similar to a new. It's very similar in yield and how it, like satellites and seismographs detecting Earth movements, on the amount of disruption a big bomb, a fuel air bomb like that causes. And the one in Turkey was gigantic. If I can find a video, I'll try and watch it. It's fantastic. It's just not. It's really cool in the but how big of an explosion that is. It's a fuel air type bomb, but that same can happen many times. We don't really see it in Vegas, but when they have all these big old grain silos, and then that this grain gets a little bit just low enough, and all of a sudden it'll have all these air mixed with the right amount of grain molecules or particles in here, and then a spark or something causes it, and it's just boom, really, really big explosions. This is also what I was talking though. If a person gets in here, it looks like nice and flat on there, but due to how it drains, so the grain after they harvest it or whatever, wheat, all different types of grain, stuff like that. Well, they'll fill it via here from the top, and then it gets emptied into whatever transportation thing afterwards after sitting here in storage. If they're going in here to do inspections, whatever, one thing they might not know, and because of just how that drains all the grain, is it's a lot less solid right here, so it's going to act kind of like quicksand. I don't know if cartoons still show. I thought quicksand was going to be a lot more dangerous and prevalent in my life. It's really not. But they'll walk on and then they'll get, because it looks solid but it's really not, they'll get pulled down and they can't get above it. So they can be stuck in here, and this is engulfment. It's kind of how it works. So suffocation and dying. And then if the rescuers have to be very careful if they know that's in there, say their buddy was there with them and they saw them go down and they either went after or they knew better and called rescue and the fire department or whoever else to come help them get this person out. If the rescuers go in there, this could be a very oxygen deficient atmosphere, or they can get stuck, so they'll try and get that person out there. Machinery entrapment, ouch, is all I have to say. Many times they have to disassemble it. Good luck trying to cut through that. They might be able to cut through that, or they're going to regrind. They're going to, if they're able to reverse it, they might turn it, have the gears turn the other way and regrind the bone out, and that person's most likely lost their hand. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's just a hand that's left in there afterwards when they had to amputate off. Or it's just a training thing, but that's what happens. So electricity in general. So here's what they're talking about, not necessarily the entanglement. And I misread the initial slide way back when. But anyways, so anytime you have a pole or a downed wire, rather high risk, and we might not know. If you start feeling a weird tingling in your legs and you see a downed wire, you need to stop immediately and bunny hop your way out, keeping your feet at equidistance, equal distance, about shoulder lengthish, or not even a little bit narrower apart. So what happens with electricity? On one side, as you get closer, it's going to have a different current than it would on the outside. We can see in these different waves. And as a person steps further, all of a sudden their body's at two different areas of electrical current, and the electricity wants to move. It then uses your body as a conduit and causes you to be electrified. So if you this is why we don't mess around with electricity, and you get the utilities there to make sure they're down. If you have any question about it, you don't know, you're not sure, who cares? Get the utility people. They have people on to respond 24/7. They have emergency response vehicles. So these are not red and white or red and blue lights, but sometimes they are. They're there. They should be there relatively quickly, depending on where you're at, and they will do it. You don't want to mess around with electricity. It kills you, and it hurts the whole time it does. Or it's so quickly you're just done. So also structural concerns, confined spaces such as like a building collapse or a trench collapse. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Compartment and crush syndrome. If you guys remember, any type where you've been entrapped for a long time, from that silo incident to a building collapse to a trench collapse, you start building the crush syndrome or compartment syndrome, just kind of do those. And if you guys remember how that all works down, the breakdown of cellular contents into the bloodstream then causes you to want or to die. If you have any questions about this or you want to remember more, go ahead and ask in class. But here's a little bit of an example of crush syndrome, secondary to entrapment. Particularly when they're stuck in there for a long time. Usually it's over 4 hours. Is a pretty good, if they're in there for longer than 4 hours, and sometimes it can be just to get everything to gain access to the patient. At that point, we need to really consider when we release them, what will happen. If we remember back when we talked about it, tourniquets are neither indicated nor contraindicated, but it kind of depends on the situation whether we think the rest of the patient's viable, and there's not a lot of evidence one way or the other, and they're not entirely sure. PHTLS had stated, or at one point they didn't have any hard thing, but a few studies I was able to find said it seems like throwing a tourniquet could be a something to do that can possibly prolong the patient's life. Sometimes it's easier to run a code or take off the tourniquet when we can try and preempt it in the hospital and have more medications such as insulin that we don't have in the field, and all the bicarb that we don't have here to try and do it then. Or they might just do an amputation in the hospital where we don't always have that access. But speaking of the amputation, this is one of those incidents where, if depending on what it is, if prior to removing the collapsed
contents from the patient, uh, get a hold of medical command. There's lots of places where they'll send out a doc and the surgical here and surgeon or whatever they kind of figure out. There's a lot more protocols and experience that. I'm not sure if UMC has any particular. That's who I would get a hold of in this instance. Get a hold of them, see what they think, and let them know, particularly if it's been over 4 hours, and if it's their large body parts, like all the way up to their upper thighs or mid thighs. That's a lot of toxic, broken down cellular material that's going to lead to the rest of the body, cause instant death. So they could do a field amputation. Another thing, just half side note, speaking of sending doctors to the field, there might be a question on the high stakes that revolves around the idea of using flight to fly a doctor to the scene. That is a thing that flight can do, not a regular instance, but it's something that could do. Hint, hint, hint. The patient may be, so they can stay pretty stable there as long as you can, but as soon as you release them, they can die within minutes to possibly seconds, at least like 10, 15, maybe 20 seconds. So here's an example of just a small part of compartment syndrome after someone had something crushed. And this is a bit more pure compartment syndrome and not necessarily having to do with crush, but as an example. So we see all these different layers of fascia and these different compartments, and their compartment syndrome in general is when you start having inflammation within this compartment, and then it causes compression on the tissues and the blood vessels that would go through here, and so all of a sudden those start breaking down and causing cellular death, releasing that in here. So this is just purely isolated compartment syndrome, but it kind of also shows what compartment syndrome from a secondary to a crush injury or entrapment can really cause to everything there, and that's all just dead tissue. Some things, OSHA requires a permit to be issued before workers may enter confined space on standard. I'm not exactly sure how the fire department work in TRT works it. I don't believe they have to call up OSHA prior to doing this. It's part of their training and certification, I believe. I will ask whoever in class, if anyone with experience in there, if there is that specific one. I'm not entirely sure as far as the rescue side if they need to, but as far as I know, they should they're certified, and much like we respond and have the ability to respond to incidents and do things that normally OSHA does not like, we get to do because we are first responders. So that's just that topic. But if they don't, if so, I just want to make, I'm just trying to separate that. But sites without permits at which no atmospheric monitoring is performed are likely locations for emergencies. If they have the permit and they do everything right, there's a way smaller chance that we're gonna be the ones responding to them because they probably don't need us there in the first place because they're not doing things wrong. That also being said, though, obviously that still can happen. Things can go wrong. But we'll see these. I believe this might be at one of those farms in the Midwest type areas. So type of other type of emergencies. Safe entry for rescuers getting in there. They're going to go in with some type of SCBA, and so self-contained breathing apparatus, just normal breathing air. Going to go in there. They'll bring an extra tank that's going to start giving O2, usually, hopefully direct O2, but depending on the situation, it might just be room air compressed in there, and they will be going in. There's a couple other ways that they can get air to these patients, and here they are. So you have your supplied air breathing apparatus. So sometimes because of the confined space, it's hard to take that full tank in there. So what they'll do for that, instead of a self-contained, is they'll have a supplied airline, like old school diving. In fact, they still do this somewhat occasionally for very deep dives, and but in that same type of concept, so there's a couple ways they can do this. They can go down and or they can put a exhaust hose in and try and pull bad air out while supplying more air, depending on how the atmosphere is in there and if it would be okay to increase the oxygen concentration. Or what they'll do is they will go in with a hose and connected to a mask. They'll go down there, and that hose will be filled with air supplying directly to the mask to the rescuer, and have one for the patient. This is why we don't rush into areas particularly confined space. I'm not claustrophobic, but I also don't like being in any area where I couldn't move at all. Not my cup of tea. Uh, so we don't want to go in there and get stuck in areas. So here's an example of trench rescues. These are very, very dangerous. I believe they actually had a couple of these recently, and you'll see this at construction sites. So they'll be having a trench due to putting pipes down, things like that. If you don't properly shore up the sides, particularly in areas like Las Vegas where we have such dry dirt and ground and sand, types of the dirt material, that it doesn't stay molded to the side very well. We don't have a lot of vegetation, which also you have a lot of vegetation as well, besides just the natural clumping of dirt that having moisture in the ground will cause, which we see with like mud. When you have a lot of vegetation, you will have their roots go down and they provide extra structure and ability to try and keep some of that up. But even there, you don't want to go down without shoring that up. Vegas just has very, very little moisture in the air, much less ground, and you have that potential for these walls to very easily collapse in on top of you. And so sometimes, whether it's a partial or full collapse, they will go in there and attempt to do the rescue. And if you don't do this correctly, and many times, I believe one of the guys who was on TRT was from one of our previous classes saying they didn't have their permits, and they were just going in there and they had this collapse just due to the extreme dry nature of the dirt, no shoring up, shoring just having wooden type structures or whatever other type structures on the side of as you're digging down, and it collapsed on top of them. We've heard of ones of, oh, they dropped their hammer or tool or something down and maybe found down in there, and they'll go, oh, I know we pulled a lot of our shoring up, I'm just going to get it as quick as you can, but as soon as they get down there, they put maybe the ladder to go down. That caused enough disturbance for the entire thing to collapse, and it is extremely dangerous. Dirt is very, very heavy. If you ever worked construction, you would and had to dig trenches, you would know, or military fill sandbags, you know, dirt and sand is very, very heavy and pain to move. This is an example of emergency shoring when they go in, and this is what they have to do prior to getting access to the patient. They do not mess around with this. You do not want to have it further collapse on you, so they will shore up the sides. Even if they have a person laying down there, rescue does not go down until they do proper shoring. They have all these tools. I'm not sure if it's on the heavy rescue or if they have another trailer or other apparatus that carries some of this, but they will shore up everything before even going down and trying to get the person out of there. Even trying to throw a rope down and causing any disturbance to pull the patient out can cause the sides to collapse. Do not go into these to get someone out. You will become a patient too. All right, real quick on highway operations. We've gone over this in the past. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. All the things that causes, we know they will turn to look, and wherever we are looking is where we start to turn our vehicle. We see bright, shiny lights. We want to look at them as humans, and then our vehicle starts to follow, and they want to run into us. Here's a great example of how to park your vehicle. You can also see where they parked a much more expensive truck with the ladder on it. So instead of like 700,000, it's like 1.4 mil or whatever else. It's a bit more expensive. They're going to tuck that in and if anything's going to take the brunt, they'll let the engine take it. Remember, engine's very heavy. It'll hit and they'll go. We talked about this a couple classes, so I'm not going to spend too much time on here. Pumpers are usually the sacrificial lamb in this case, and not the ambulances and rescues are cheaper, but not the heavy rescue, but the normal rescues that fire uses. But they're not going to stop a big vehicle from going. Fuel, another hazard. We're going to do a lot more into hazmat. I'm not going to spend too much time, but remember, there's a huge danger if battery had not been disconnected, and there's still usually somewhat of a charge before reaching in and putting our head next to the patient in front of the steering wheel or any inside the car. There's always that chance of it going off again. Always important. Electricity, if it's some type of fuel, can spark the fire, and almost all vehicles have fuel, and even the ones that don't then have their own fire hazard. They're giant. Teslas tend to catch fire and stay on fire for about 30 not 30 minutes, a day or longer. So you guys can look closely and see what type of vehicle that is. Many times caused by ruptured fuel tanks and fuel lines ignited during the crash. incidents are trapped, if the victims are trapped in the, is not fully involved, engulfed by flames, you can make a choice to try and get those people out. I had a buddy in high school was driving home, a truck had actually gone down one of the big hills out where I live. I was going to high school in Arizona, and he just, the brakes caught on fire, slammed into the median. He was actually alive. He kept trying to go back. My buddy pulled him out, and then another car that had started on fire, and it's like all over the news and stuff. But you can do it if you can do it safely. If it's fully engulfed like this picture is, don't. I'm not saying you should. I'm saying if it's not fully engulfed, you can, and maybe you'll be on the news or get an award from the fire department. But if it's anything like this, I'd stay way, way far away. One instance you can see that's an ambulance, and one thing about the ambulance is it has pressurized O2 tanks. So not only if that tank has a failure, it now becomes a rocket, sun guide, not a missile, and then also it can leak oxygen everywhere and cause that fire to get a whole lot bigger and engulf the vehicle that much quicker. Another cool video we'll watch here in class. Can't watch it necessarily on here for whatever reason. I don't think it doesn't seem to play. Pretty interesting. We'll go with that. All right. So alternate fuel systems, like I said, Teslas. They've actually, some places have developed a protocol to put them in like a Connex box and just let them burn out. They burn for a very long time, so there's a big issue with those big batteries. Some of the other ones. We're talking about alternative fuel system vehicles. Don't, if it has an orange cable, don't get near it. That's high voltage. It will kill you and hurt the whole time. Down electrical wires, we talked about that. Even if it looks dead or supposedly dead, and it's not bouncing around the ground like a snake. It still might have some electricity going through it, and that electricity can be enough to kill you, or it can all of a sudden be activated again. Get utilities there, get Nevada Power, whatever it is down here. Don't pay that much, don't pay attention. Never approach a scene, even if you know wire on the car. They might be in a distressed state. Do not get close there. You will become a patient too, or a statistic. We don't want to do that. If you start feeling that tingling sensation, soles your feet, legs, or thorax, stop and retreat. You should hop around. I know it sounds silly, but we look here. Victims inside a vehicle that are in contact. So if you do start feeling that, you can hop on. You don't want to spread your feet. Keep your feet even closer than shoulder around. You can shuffle away, but you don't lift your feet then, because the lifting of the feet then causes your body to become a circuit, and that's not ideal, because that's how electricity wants to travel. So a couple of different here, we'll talk about milliamps and amps. When electricity, absolutely necessary for whatever reason, they use some conductive things such as like a rope or different things that can help. I'd be very cautious with TRT will do it. Don't. Just us as medics aren't going to do it. Here's an example of what they will use. So as we see, we have our different currents that can do 1 milliamp, barely perceptible. 1 to 3, we can feel this. 3 to 9, painful sensation. 9 to 25 milliamps, muscle contraction, and you can't let go. It's a little bit different from AC to D guy, just DC, yeah, DC and AC. DC and AC, there we go. 25 to 60, respiratory paralysis. Your diaphragm is unable to move and can kill you. 60 milliamps or more can cause VFib, most likely fatal. We can probably get you back. And tissue burning at 5 amps or more. So, yeah, and if it's real localized, in the case like lightning strikes and so in there, that localized is alright-ish. But if your whole body is frying due to electricity flying through it, it's a real bad day. Some more highway operation things. Unstable vehicles are common hazards. This is an example of cribbing. There's a ton of different ones. I believe only the heavy rescue LVFR has the crazy amount of cribbing. The trucks might have some. Every department is different on where they keep some. We had an engine out from a department in Arizona that they ran mainly highway calls, so they had all this cribbing on their engine. Just note that many times though, if you have vehicles on top of one another on unstable areas, they might need the heavy rescue just due to the extra supplies in the cribbing. This is an example like wood cribbing. They make it in plastic versions. They have these giant airbags that can fill of both kind of lower pressure, which just will lift a lot off of like 6 inches, and then they have these other ones that expand up to like that height. And so it's can be very, they have all types of different tools, and just depending on what local agency is responding and what they'll have. But sometimes they need to do this. If you try and go, even say, open this door to try and access this patient prior to all this cribbing there, and you open the door, it could cause that entire vehicle to come over and fall on you. Once again, I want to go home at the end of shift. Vehicles even directly on their side, unstable. 4 wheels, maybe the roof if it's a small passenger car. But then good luck getting access to that. Could happen, not saying. So here's some examples of different types of cribbing all around. They have all types of different things here. Some are able to expand and contract, whether by hydraulics, air, or otherwise, and some are just pieces of wood. They all work decently well. Come along and rescue jacks. There's a number of different things that, but before they threw this ladder up here, they made sure to secure, and the other side should be secured as well, so that they know that vehicle is not moving prior to accessing the vehicle. It may seem like, oh, I can just open the door and get this patient out, until a 8,000-pound vehicle rolls over on top of you, and your statistic again. Airbag supplemental restraint systems. Many new vehicles have this many airbags. We just don't deal with it as much. This is also why cutting into newer type cars, as far as extrication goes, take some caution not to cut into the different areas that could have a maybe undeployed airbag, and why there's a lot of training involved with all this stuff, but it's kind of fun cutting things open. Once they're already deployed, they're typically not dangerous. They're many times deflatable themselves, although they might retain some air. They do have a residue because it has a little bit of powder on there, and sometimes that can cause some medical reactions to it, but usually it's pretty relatively safe once they're already deployed. It's the undeployed airbags in an MVA that's dangerous. Example. If you, we'll go over in class, but that was one of a firefighter back probably 10, 15 years ago, putting his head in. They didn't disconnect the power. Can't remember the exact story there. And the airbag, as he's reaching in over the patient, exploded and hit his head. That is enough to break your neck. Real bad. Hazmat, we're going to get a lot more into hazmat in the hazmat section, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on it today. They have a couple different numbers that they can track things and placards and things. We're going to get more into hazmat. I don't know why it's in this chapter. All right, vehicle anatomy, rescue operations require basic understanding. Car, roof, roof support post, the firewall, and engine compartments. Firewall is going to be between the engine and the engine compartment. Obviously, glass, we have tempered glass on the sides and laminated glass on the front. That's why you can, if you hit the side, the windows that roll up and down, they shatter but into non-sharp objects. And then the laminated glass has two, much like a laminated paper, but basically two pieces of type of lamination on the glass, and that's why it doesn't shatter, because they don't want glass shards coming at your face if something flies up and hits you, and that's why the glass will break within that laminate. And if you ever had a crack in your windshield as it spreads, and not shatter at you, where if that same force hit the tempered glass in the side, it breaks. And if it hit the glass that's at your house, then you have very sharp objects. But the different types of glass are made different ways. Construction, I think we have some more slides coming up. If not, but it basically has different types. You have unibody. This is number one, so I'm not going to get too far deep into that. You have your roof, then you have support posts. A post at the front, B post at the next post back, C post typically at the back end. However, if you have like a van or a bus, you have all the way to like C post. But it just goes back. So A post is the front 2 posts, B post is the next post back, and so on and so on. Here's an example of that. So engine, we have the firewall right here. So if the engine catches fire, there's some type of break between the engine compartment and the engine gets real hot and the rest of the compartment of the vehicle. Roof, we have our A posts, and this is on both sides. B post, C post, and for the van, minivan, SUV, van, so on and so forth. You have D post, E post, whatever else goes back. Hopefully there's not more than 26 posts in the car. If so, well, it's a train now. All right, this is called a nadir pin from former presidential candidate Ralph Nader actually helped design this, and it's named after him. That is a extremely hard case hardened steel. It's very difficult to cut. If like you can kind of with some, you would never cut your shears. It would laugh at your shears and break them. Even when you're cutting open cars, this thing does not want to come out. It's meant. That's what your door actually latches onto, and it keeps your door from flying open in case of accidents. It's a Nader pin. I don't know if there's a question. I forget if there's a question about Nader pins on there, but Nader pin. This is an example of really bad day. Where do you start on this? Talk about MCIs, ICS. Some cars need cut open, some don't. There's fires involved here. I-40 gets these one every couple of years, it seems. There's been big 40, 50 car pileups. You get these on all over. You tend to get it in places where all of a sudden you lose visibility. And so Flagstaff and I-40, all of a sudden it goes from 2,000, 3,000 feet up to 5,000 in northern Arizona part, and then when you get up to Flagstaff, it's at 7,000. So they might be driving, not expecting they're in the middle of Arizona, and all of a sudden it starts snowing and they lose visibility. And when the visibility reemerges, or it doesn't reemerge till later, but they will smack into the back of the vehicle in front of them because everyone starts slowing down, and you just get these giant pileups. Many times with many of these pileups with that, there's not always, many of the patients are fine. There might be some walking wounded, but then there's usually a few that happen due to high impact, particularly if you got semis involved that are going fast. There's a ton of interesting videos you can watch. All of a sudden, vehicles stopping and a semi truck just plowing into the back of some of these. It happens in the Midwest a lot, or anywhere there's lots of fog, there's that possibility. If they're used to it, it's not as big a deal. But when you have areas where they're not used to visibility disappearing, obviously big incidents. Here's another example. Where are you going to start? What are you going to kind of do? We look at this and you just see crushed cars everywhere. You see Humvees on the back of a semi truck trailer there. Everything's crushed and don't even know where to start necessarily. Start helping people, and this is big incident. All right, start getting to the last part of these. Got about 20-ish minutes, I think, so left. Hazardous terrain, and we'll talk about high angle, low angle, and flat terrain obstructions, rescue operations with that. This is obviously flat or low angle at best. And we do these type of rescues all the time. You can do these very easily, and many times this is someone's up on a mountain, break their ankle, you need to get them off the mountain, so you're going to get them on a Stokes stretcher, some other type of stretcher, and haul them out by hand. The more people you have on that, the better and the safer it is for everyone involved. Many times you rotate who is at what position just due to body weight distribution and just kind of lifting and walking. We see this here. At a minimum, it's usually like 6 people. You can kind of do it with 4, but this is an example of low angle operations and high angle. High angle, they're using ropes. Low angle, you're typically not using ropes, although you might use ropes as a guide, but you're not supported by them. Typically, high angle has a slope of greater than 60 degrees. Another example, high angle, even though it doesn't seem that it's not as crazy, it's not a cliff, but they're going down as high angle rescue. High angle rescue is a bit more dangerous and a lot more intensive. Low angle can be intensive, but typically not as bad. Flat rescue, just rocks, boulders, things you got to worry about. Different types of ropes. Here's some examples, and some of our guys probably know all these. I knew many of them at one time. This is just an example that they had from Sanders. So here's some different examples of ropes. We do not teach you ropes in this class because that would be silly. Stokes basket or basket stretcher is here, easy to carry with enough people, and something like this, you can have as many people hold on to this as you can fit around it that can walk comfortably. Typically 6 to 8 is a pretty standard number. When you're walking several miles, carrying something with one hand, that's why even if you just rotate the sides so only one arm isn't getting as fatigued, things like that. You can throw a backboard in there if you need to, scoop stretcher, things like that. And that's also why that wheel underneath takes off a lot of weight and helps out a ton, but it does kind of pain in the butt sometimes. It's more of a rescue stretcher. The wire mesh is the Stokes. The plastic ones work. The plastic's a nice one that can break down. 2, they float. Good for they're lighter usually. Can be used. They all can be used out of a helicopter, depending as long as they have the right connections. It doesn't actually have to be wire or plastic. And its movie may include evacuation litter
carrying over flat terrain. Special rescue equipment may be required for low angle, high angle, all the different stuff. Aerial apparatus, so the rescue or helicopters can very help. They have things called short haul versus long haul. Short haul is basically, and most helicopters can do short haul. Short haul particularly is what they will, and then there's hoist operations. Short haul, they have a rope attached to the bottom of the helicopter. They will have a rescuer attached, sometimes not even a helicopter crew member, but a search and rescue guy. They will lower the patient, or they'll have the person on there. They'll fly them over to where they need to do the rescue. They'll connect it. They'll get the patient onto there, and they will lift up and take them out. Sometimes they can do this via. They don't need to land first unless they have the connection on already, or they will just set up, but then they'll still deploy out of the helicopter, or they can start kind of from they'll fly above, drop their rope, connect it, can then connect the person, and just kind of lift like you're skiing behind a boat, but you're hanging underneath the helicopter instead. Works really well. They move them a short distance to wherever. We didn't do the short haul part, but many times when we were doing operations out of the canyon, we would be there they would do their rescue operation, short haul or whatever else, and then we would take their patient to the actual patient transport. They'd transfer the patient over to us. Many times it's over to ground, and then transport to the hospital. Now, hoist operations is a little bit different. Hoist operations where there's a hoist that lowers and raises a rope via a machine in the helicopter, and it just automatically lowers it down and raises it. Typically, those are relatively heavy, at a few hundred pounds altogether with all the machinery, connections, everything, and usually by dual engine aircrafts, and they're not dual engine rotor wings are not as common. Obviously, Coast Guard places like that, military, even areas like the Grand Canyon, they will with a dual engine, and they can do hoist operations. But you'll many times see just that short hauling happen more. Different ways, and how you can rotate around, and just so you're not getting as fatigued when you're hiking miles and miles with the patient on a stretcher. This is an example of that. I got a little bit ahead there. Example of short haul right here. Short haul, they are connected to the bottom of the aircraft. They're lifting them up and they're moving them from the side of the cliff or else. It's a really cool video. I'll see if I can try and find it for class. Where this base jumper jumped off the side of the cliff. Wind blew him into the cliff again, and he was hanging. His parachute caught on either a rock or a tree that was hanging off the side of the cliff, and he was hanging there. And Arizona DPS, Department of Public Safety, like NHP, flew, did a rescue. It was actually a short haul, I believe. Picked up the patient off the side of the cliff and moved him out. This above is MD6 or 900. I want to say it's 600. Has no tail rotor at all. It uses airflow from the rotor as it gets pushed down, and it follows these channels and keeps the helicopter from spinning. It's wizardry. I don't exactly understand it, but you can see the hoist out right here on the side, and what that does is it raises and lowers the thing. This is what you see the Coast Guard do a lot more. However, most search and rescue and local operations throughout at least Arizona and parts of Nevada use short hauling more often than they use this. Not a lot of areas have access to a full hoist helicopter. They're just a lot more expensive. The engines are one of the most expensive parts of a helicopter, and since it has two, it's twice as expensive, usually a bit more. Being said, during there, they're not going to tend to do a lot. When we talk to city fire guys, the Dustin Ostocks, they don't do very much medical care during the rescue attempt itself, other than what's necessary. If they're having an anaphylactic shock on the side of a cliff, yep, we're going to throw some epi on, but that's about it. Sometimes, like I said, they'll give a patient a little bit of Versed to calm them down so they can safely remove the patient from the scene. Many times, even when we were climbing up a mountain to go do rescues out in Arizona, what we do is we would drop all of the equipment that was not needed. Unless you know that they're having some type of breathing event, don't bring that heavy O2 tank. Break it down. If we had special packs that we'd just grab, and it was on our BC rig, we'd take it, we'd put what medical equipment we needed in there, because you can be hiking for miles up there, and you don't want to be carrying a ton of extra things that aren't needed. Most of the time, we didn't bring a monitor unless there was some type of indication that we would need it. You carry your minimal NARCs and BVM, a couple other, probably Supergladic would work fantastic just in case. bandages, splints, a couple things. You want to really be aware of that weight. Even if you've hiked with a decent amount of weight, just know it gets, if you're having a 50-pound bag on your back and then you are carrying a patient for over 2-3 miles, really starts wear you down. And in the heat in the desert out here, it can really get, it just adds on to things. Water is something very important to bring if it's going to be any type of longer distance getting to these locations. And like I said, this was not anything as when we did this as part of like TRT or anything like that, particularly because it was like flat dish ground or climbing up a mountain, but not rocks. So it wasn't really low angle either. I guess technically could be that, but in really we're walking trails up the mountain. But many times paramedics, even in this valley, have gone out and had to walk to scenes way far out. So if that's the case, think of some of the different things that you would use. If you're curious, our and search and rescue should be there. Link up with them and see what they have of the patient information already. If they have any suggestions, if they have gear, anything like that, and they can help us with carry some of the gear if we need more things that. And so we're distributing the weight evenly across all of us. Um, when we're talking about a medic and a rescue on some type of team, try and establish rapport, try and keep the patient calm in some of these situations. This is a little bit more in the rescue S side of it instead of just hiking out to a place to get them. But some things to do. Uh, Many times, some patient care may have to be improvised during the rescue. You might not be following protocols exactly. I wouldn't say break protocols, but if you're finding yourself using challenges, many of our traditional care that we have everything in the back of an ambulance isn't always available in these situations. So you might have to make some adjustments to how you're doing things and go through there. If you need to do anything super crazy, I'm not sure, way far away, and you're unsure if it seems like it might break protocol that the doctors would be mad at, go ahead and call a hospital and figure it out. EMC is a safe one most of the time. Or if you know what hospital you're going to be transporting to, just due to you being up by Red Rock, you know you're going to Summerlin because it's not trauma, whatever else, then yeah, call the hospital you're going to be transporting and see if they have any, they're good with what your plans of actions are, or call your medical director, see if he's on board, if you have their number. I know that was one thing we did a lot. Hey, doing this is our situation that we're doing. What are you thinking? Okay, cool. And then that way you have your medical director already on board of that. It's not always available, but sometimes that's a good option. Pain control can be really good, particularly morphine and or fentanyl, just to kind of relax them a bit. If they have a broken leg and they're out there, it'll make the transport a lot easier. Ketamine can work pretty well too, because then you're not worried about those hemodynamic compromises as much or respiratory depression. So ketamine can be fantastic for both pain and or sedation or a little bit of both. By sedation, we know it's dissociation, but same thought. Don't put it at a dose where they're out there seeing dragons, so they're not trying to fight you even more as they're hanging, or as they're in the unique situation where you don't want them freaking out. Just things to think about. More rescue operations will be supplemented coming up from LVFR training field trip. Working on that still, and if for some reason it doesn't come through, we can supplement this a little bit more a different way if we need to, but they usually do a pretty good job and they've helped us out most of the time and they get some training out. So that being said, any other questions, go ahead and write them down, bring them into class. Fun days. Goodbye.